Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. As the United States of America approaches its 250th anniversary, Christians are once again debating the moral significance of the American founding. Was the American Revolution an act of justified resistance or a failure of civic obedience? Romans 13 commands us to be subject to the governing authorities. Jesus famously told us to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. We talk more about this with Mitchell Bahnsen. Mitchell is a student at Westmont College studying politics, philosophy, and economics, and he is the author of this recent work in the public discourse, Romans 13 and the American Revolution. Mitchell, thank you for joining us again. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Always a joy to reconnect. So let's frame the conversation in terms of understanding, firstly, what Paul was talking about in Romans 13. What does he say, and how should we understand it?
Yeah, when Paul tells Christians to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, he is explaining to believers all over the Roman Empire who are faced with oppression, faced with persecution and martyrdom, that there are certain things that transcend the role of government, and there are certain things that God has given to government in order to preserve order on earth. So he's giving kind of a twofold message of government's very important, and Christians need to listen to it because it is established by God at some level. Well, at the same time, they cannot do everything, and some things need to be rendered only to God that Caesar has no control over, like our soul, like our faith life. So it's sort of a double message there from the Apostle Paul.
And that double message, therefore, carries with it a responsibility of prudent discernment in applying that principle.
Absolutely, it does. And there are many ways where it's been twisted and over the centuries of the church. But yeah, there's many interpretations, even amongst faithful believers.
Now, tell us then about how we can start thinking about the American Revolution.
Yeah, so upon first glance, I think most Christians in the United States today would say, well, the revolution was justified, the king was tyrannical, and that's kind of it. And of course, there is an important argument there and something to that. But at the same time, we need to remember that at the time, colonists who all professed the Christian religion took on very different approaches, some dependent on their own theological tradition, and then some just disagreeing with one another in general. So yeah, when it comes to the founding, we need to just keep in mind that there are a lot of great resources and great, our forefathers had different visions morally, but we have to discern them individually and see what the different arguments are to discern that. So
let's therefore assess this based on how we think, what are some of the ways in which we think about the revolution? For example, you highlight the Lockean rights first approach.
Yeah, so the Declaration is very clearly derived from Locke's second treatise of government. Life, liberty, property kind of being interpreted as the pursuit of happiness, the freedom to do what you want. And you see that with Allen and Mather. They take on kind of Locke's anthropology and Locke's view of the state of nature, the role of the state to protect those rights, and apply that as this is directly from the scriptures. And I think that there is some, sort of agreement there between the scriptures and Locke, but it's not a wholeheartedly Lockean scripture, of course. So we have to kind of discern where Locke works and where he doesn't, especially in the sort of temporal implications of Locke's thought about what government is supposed to be.
You highlight John Allen's oration upon the beauties of liberty, and that is a great assessment on the thought, in this case of the founders, which presents us that picture that you just shared. We need to have some level of prudence to be able to see where Locke ends and where the scriptures, where natural law takes off.
Right, absolutely. And with Allen, it's interesting because he is making a good point that the king is violating their rights. The problem is, those rights are the rights that Locke talks about. They're not necessarily rights that are guaranteed to Christians in the New Testament by any means. So when we kind of look at Romans 13 and look at the whole body of Paul's work especially, we have to understand that just because our rights are being violated by the governing authority doesn't mean we go start an uprising. I mean, many of the Israelite people in the New Testament wanted to start an uprising, the Zealots, and Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So we can't just sort of rinse and repeat and just take that as it is. We have to understand that the rights may be violated, but the role of Christians is not necessarily to overthrow the government because of that.
Now, we can move on from there to then think about the source of rights, right? Between what Locke says, but also what the Christian revelation, in this case, what Paul says. Help us frame that rightly.
Yeah, so Locke says that in order to get out of a state of nature, this sort of chaotic state, we agree to come under a social contract, essentially. And this is a very helpful tool. I'm a proud, beneficiary of liberalism, that a great tradition from Locke. But at the same time, rights are not the main focus of the Apostle Paul's work or of Christ's ministry. The focus of Christ's ministry is his kingdom, and his kingdom is not of this world. So I think we have to remember that, yeah, rights are important in terms of preserving a temporal order, but we need to order our affections. I talk about Augustine at the end of the article a little bit. We need to order our affections to remind ourselves that the city of God is where we belong. The city of man is important, and we interact with the earthly city on a daily basis and have a responsibility there too, but we have to keep things in their proper place.
And the keeping things in their proper place means being a student of both the biblical revelation, but also about history and the people who influence, the thinkers who influenced, in this case, our founders.
Absolutely. And there are many great benefits the founders gave us, and I think we have set up a society and a country that protects people's dignity and preserves a Christian moral anthropology better than pretty much any place on earth in human history. So we can be grateful for that while still questioning some of those theoretical impulses to say, well, Locke is exactly what Paul is talking about, because clearly there is more of a tension there than people want to admit.
Would John Wesley's perspective provide the counterbalance to the Lockean perspective?
He certainly would. And the problem with Wesley for us Americans is he's a Tory. He is supportive of the king and says Christians have no business pushing back against the king, but they just need to be basically obedient. And well, that is not obviously a popular answer for us Americans. When you take a kind of a bland reading of Romans 13, it seems like, oh yeah, we have to just put up with it. And I think that there's something to that. There's also a reminder of like, okay, what happens when there is significant injustice being done, which there was with the king, and in other cases, maybe even more extreme. So Wesley needs to be qualified too, but, upon a first glance of Romans 13, he might be onto something.
Now, Wesley, by his own writings, is he detecting and creating a kind of polemic against what we would now consider the Lockean influence?
Sort of. He actually is a very fair reader of Locke. He makes the point that people under the charter of the king in a colony are no longer in a state of war. They are colonists. They think the colonists governed by charter is the language he uses. So that means that within our social contract, we've agreed to kind of give up our chaotic war of all against all in the Hobbesian sense, and we've instead moved to deferring to the king and what he has to say. So he of course is, that sort of polemical component of it. Yeah, he is saying you do not have to just put up with whatever the king says necessarily, and that's where the qualification needs to come in. But yeah, he is making that point.
One of the things that Wesley puts forth that seems to be a kind of absolutist gospel of the Lockean premise is that liberty is, in this case, master of all. And Wesley is concerned that too much liberty or the abuse of absolute liberty is itself going to be a problem. How much freer do we have to be? Independence by itself will not make us free. So I'm talking with Mitchell Bahnsen. He's a student at Westmont College, and he is the author, most recently, of this piece, Romans 13 and the American Revolution. Were the thought of our founders anti-Christian? I've heard theonomists, I've heard integralists make this claim. I beg to differ. I don't think that there's an inherent rejection of the Christian claim, but we do need to qualify how Christians can think about the revolution rightly. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Mitchell Bahnsen, student at Westmont College, student of politics, philosophy, and economics. We're talking about the founding of the United States and whether it comports with Romans 13 and the biblical worldview. So I left us with a bit of a cliffhanger, Mitchell, about Wesley's critique on an overt and absolutist view of independence and liberty, warning us, independence is not going to make us free. Republics themselves are no less anarchic or despotic than monarchies, as you rightly mentioned. So shed some light on this for us.
Yeah, he basically says liberty and sort of autonomy is not the highest virtue. It actually can be a significant danger. And there's not really one system of government that we want to pursue, and we're sort of wasting our time arguing about it. We have a calling as Christians, and ultimately in the eschaton, we will sit under our own vine and fig tree, as Micah 4:4 points out. Mm-hmm. So his focus sort of shifts to something a little more big picture theologically, and he says, let's not argue as much about the governmental system side of it.
I love that you quoted Micah 4:4 because that was one of Washington's favorite verses. He quoted it at least 3 times throughout his presidency, which gives us tremendous perspective that there is an appeal here to the biblical concept of flourishing within a land, and the governance of that land, in this case, not a monarchy but a republic, has an obligation to bring that about in the lives of the citizenry.
Absolutely, and I'm sort of with Washington on his use more than with Wesley on his. Mm-hmm. They're making different points using the same text, which again shows the difficulty of interpreting a scripture in that way. But yeah, Washington is right. It is in a republic that people are able to exercise their liberty and pursue what they want under the realm of virtue, in a measured sense that we obviously can lose sight of in despotism or monarchy or a republic. We see this plenty these days, But yeah, that is ultimately the goal, that we have flourishing within a land and we're able to pursue the ends under the realm of virtue.
Which leads us back to Wesley and the question on Romans 13. Because he had a proper read of Romans 13, he put forth this concept that government exists for the curtailing of evil and, to whatever degree possible, the creation of the avenues necessary for human flourishing. But by itself, the government is not responsible for bringing about the flourishing of the human person.
That's right. And he basically says, colonists, you guys need to be grateful. Britain protected you from the French in the French and Indian War. You guys just need to take the protection, pay the taxes, because that's what it costs to protect you guys, and sort of go from there. It's not about the king. The king doesn't get to just make your life great. The king has done his responsibility. It's time for you to do yours, which is taxation. That's sort of where he goes with it.
Now, because of that, let's move on then to the question of John Witherspoon, one of the signers of the Declaration. How would he fare considering Wesley's position and Locke's position?
Yeah, so his focus is very different. He takes an account called Providence First, is what I kind of referred to in the article, where basically God has set about the course of history and knows what is going to happen, and is sort of his glory will be preserved. So in the meantime, we are supposed to do what we're called to, and all things will ultimately end for his glory. But it's not about us exactly bringing something about, and we got to fight for what God wants as much as obediently following what he has set out for us. It's sort of shifting your perspective to allow God's will to be done in a more passive, not, sort of passive on our end, in obedience.
That therefore leads us to a big part of the problem we have today, which is I think we have become passive. We've taken for granted that we have the greatest political experiment in human history, and so we just presume all will be well. But that political experiment did not come without cost of great intellectual consideration and also great virtue building.
Absolutely, that's right, and we need to sort of remind ourselves of that. Of this is not something that's just a given. We are an anomaly in history. The American experiment of liberty and a pursuit of equality over time. That is something that is unique that we need to appreciate and not take for granted. And Witherspoon himself knew that. Witherspoon is the only one of these men who signed the Declaration of Independence, who was for independence from Britain, while still qualifying it by saying God is in charge. We are not the ones in control here. The Lord is.
Now, because of that, I want to ask you to take us deeper. This language of providence, the Lord is in control. What does he demand of us?
Yeah, so the Lord demands obedience, and we will see that when men are immoral, when men are acting against God, he has this great quote. It will all lead to the promotion of the glory of God, and in the meantime, his mercy and kindness shall appear in prescribing bounds to their rage and fury. So no matter what rebellion or sin that the human beings might have, it will all be turned for God's glory and for our good. So it's, of course, a matter of obedience in our earthly life for those who love Jesus and know the Lord, while at the same time keeping that eternal perspective in mind. You sort of have to hold a tension there of it's not all up to me, but I do have a responsibility to obey the Lord.
I want to ask your opinion on, mildly tangential from this piece. Very simply, why is the tendency to be reductionistic and extreme about our analysis? Why do we have that tendency? Especially when it comes to things like the American founding.
Yeah, I think we want a very clear-cut picture. I think, honestly, these debates help in culture war discussions. If God is on my side of, the founding is this, then it'll help my argument. But obviously we know that things are complex and sin corrupts everything, including our knowledge and our understanding of history. So we have to remain qualified and not sort of turn these arguments into something that could be ammo for a culture war discussion.
So Romans 13, it doesn't really dissolve, like you rightly note, these tensions, but it does provide us a framework if we know how to walk the virtuous mean. We don't want to be absolutist about our independence, the way Locke would essentially call us to do, but we also don't want an overt extreme of obedience to civil authority, devoid of being able to call them to moral accountability.
That's exactly right. We don't want to sit back and allow sort of oppression to take place, but we also don't want to be like the French Revolution, just a chaotic mess of that leads into anarchy and eventually the rise of Napoleon. So maintaining these tensions is something that the American experiment has done relatively well, but it's something that has to be continued to practice. It cannot just be, we cannot sit aside and let things just like you said play out. We have to remember that we cannot be submitting without love, because then that allows for quietism and for people to get hurt, and we cannot resist without any restraint or any prudence, because then we just chase after our kind of base impulses at the expense of what is just.
So in this 250th year of the anniversary of our nation, let's talk about how we can move forward in an honest review of what we have in the American founding, being good students of our history, but also a spirit of gratitude that's so completely lacking today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big help to that is reading the founders and reading the hard parts, recognizing the flaws of the founders. I think many people, especially those who love America, as I do, want to act like the founders were in themselves some type of gods. And this is not true. They were human beings just like we are. They were great men and women, but we have to remember that they're human and they had flaws. And that actually allows us to appreciate our founding even more, that regular people trying to do the right thing could create such a beautiful experiment despite some of their shortcomings.
So we have about 3 minutes left in the segment, and I want to take a good look at what Augustine of Hippo in A City of God would tell us about realizing that while we are citizens of a particular nation, or in this case of the world, we are not eternal sojourners here.
That's exactly right. I end the article with a quote, and it's actually part of a longer quote. It's after the sacking of Carthage by the barbarians, and Augustine says, "This is grievous news. This is something terrible. The sack is not a good thing, and this is really a tragedy. But men build cities and men destroy cities. But there's also the city of God, and that's where we all belong." So it doesn't deny the importance of this earthly life and the need for good institutions, but it's ordering those things in submission to the heavenly city, to the glorious city that we all will experience for those who know the Lord.
Now, Mitchell, I want to say thank you very much for making the time to speak with us. Always a joy to connect with you, and you're a very good thinker on these matters. I always appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're talking to Mitchell Bahnsen, student at Westmont College studying politics, philosophy, and economics. Just to round off what Mitchell was saying, we've been looking at Romans 13 and considering the founding of the United States of America. Our founding fathers were influenced by a myriad of thinkers, chief among which was John Locke, Enlightenment political philosopher, and that has unfortunately led many Catholics, especially, but frankly a lot of Christian theologians as well, to argue that therefore the founding of the United States was a purely Masonic Enlightenment enterprise rather than a conglomerate of influences. So I want to set the record straight in a few terms here. Our founding fathers quoted from no text more than the book of Deuteronomy. And they appealed, every one of them, to a man, appealed to the Christian scriptures, even the two historical deists or natural theists that were among them, and these were Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Even they appealed to a biblical worldview, a biblical structure and social hierarchy for the moral, civic expectation of every person who functions within this republic that they were building. Virtue and religion were considered the indispensable supports for the sake of the flourishing of the nation. So the way forward here is to not be so extremely Lockean, but at the same time also not so obediential to the ruling regime that we forget we are called to live in providence. This is not our eternal home, but we have to have a spirit of gratitude for the great gift of this nation and to fight to purify and preserve it. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.